what were some of the, events, sort of material relations or conditions that led to AIM being founded?
Well, as I've already mentioned, you have like the 1968 Fort Laramie Treaty, and that's important due to its use in many different groups like AIM at the time, Red Power groups, we call them. Their use of this treaty and the laws surrounding it towards their organizing ends, right? So, like the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz. Happens a year after AIM is founded, so it's not technically part of the onus, but there's an even earlier one that occurs along the same time as the Pasquale fishing wars, and so and if you don't know about that, in the Pacific Northwest, cops were arresting Native people for practicing treaty rights all the time. Same things were happening in the Walleye Wars over here in the Midwest. Like there was literal murders happening about this shit. White people would drive around with bumper stickers that said, "Save a deer, kill an Indian, save a fish, spear an Indian." Like wild stuff. And nobody really talks about it. Nobody really wants to talk about anti-Native racism a lot of times. Like there's a bar that I sell tamales in, and every time I go in there, they have old Westerns on the TV, and I'll just look up and I see red face. Nobody's going to talk about that. But yeah, so like the conditions are 500 years old. When Columbus came here, that's where we have to start to look on why AIM comes about, because we're Marxists. Or at least I hope you are if you're listening. But, we're looking at this from a dialectical and historical materials perspective of how did we get here? And it starts all the way back at Columbus. And then you have to go into like the advent of mercantilism. Columbus was kind of like a doomsayer theorist that wanted to colonize Palestine quicker, basically. Very fascinating, but the Reconquista, like there's a lot of in-depth history. And then why does the Reconquista come about? So like it's a lot of history, and we're going to limit ourselves, right, to like the last 200 American history. Let's just stick to the American history, right? And we'll also ebb and flow back to the origins of material conditions that lead up to it, because sometimes it's not relevant to bring up the historical backing until we get to that point of the story that it is relevant, right? And so bear with me as I do a sort of oral history style of presentation for you. But this is kind of like a synopsized version of this documentary I was talking about at the beginning that I'm making. So here's my first work through of the thought. And it's not really my first, but a big thing is prisons. What are prisons? What role do they serve? And this is controversial because a lot of people believe in prison slavery, which isn't necessarily not true in the sense of wage slavery, right? But it's much more complex than that. Like labor in prison is a privilege. Most laborers in prison are white. The good jobs are definitely given to the whites. Like there is at the very core of prison is a white supremacist structure that is enforced through systemic efforts to create a self-participatory oppression, right? The inmates help maintain this order too, and it's sort of how the structure was set up and exasperated to in order to prevent things like Attica, right? And so at this time, you do like Attica's around the same period, like there's a lot of going on with the Black civil rights movement, and natives since 1923 when we were forced to have citizenship, we obviously weren't being afforded the same rights. We weren't allowed to join the unions. Like all these same things that are happening to New African folk are also happening to us, and we start to see Black nationalist groups organizing themselves towards change and start to model our behavior after that. And so you see a lot of different groups popping up at that time. So you have like the International Indian Brotherhood, you have the Native American Congress, there's a couple different groups that are pretty major people's lexicon, but you also have AIM coming out of this period, and they come out of the prison specifically. A lot of people will say, well, it's 1968 in Minneapolis because of Ojibwe warrior saying that, and Dennis Banks claiming, this is when it starts. But in reality, it starts as a study group, a cultural study group within the walls of the prison and organizing towards religious rights for Native prisoners. So because of this initial study group, we get Native American studies. Like, if we're actually asking, where does Native American studies come from? It comes from Stillwater Prison in Minnesota, made by the inmates themselves. And so what happens is there's a lot of residential schools and like child kidnapping going on, and like several young men who come to form AIM at the beginning all end up in prison together, and they start studying together. They create bonds with each other, and when they get outside, they want to organize towards change because they saw what people were doing with like the Black Panthers. Dennis Banks directly quotes them as a source of inspiration, but it was Clyde Bellecourt and Eddie Benton Benet who formed this initial group. And the way they get into prison is just they were a lifetime of incarceration since they were children. They have been put into an institution ran by the state and punished carcerally. Eddie ends up in prison for pushing a white guy off a Native woman he was trying to like push into a car. What the circumstances surrounding that doesn't matter. You see a white guy pushing a Native woman into the car, try to help, because we can see today with the MMIW issue, thousands of indigenous women go missing. Thousands of indigenous people, but like indigenous man back then should definitely have stepped in that circumstance. And he then goes to prison because the dude hits his head on the curb and dies of a brain hemorrhage. So he gets manslaughter. Dennis Banks is in there because he stole groceries for his large family of 9, and then his footprints in the snow led right back to his place. He was just trying to eat. And yeah, I mean, the circumstances that brought them there don't really matter, but it also speaks to like the extreme poverty. What we have is this mass transfer of Native people through bribery, essentially, and lies. It's not even real bribery. It's lying. They promise like jobs and housing and blah, 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 blah. But really, they promise the opportunity for jobs and housing and blah, blah, blah. And so they start to pay people to leave the reservation and go to these huge city centers. So like Cleveland, Denver, Seattle, Portland, like these all become like known for being, I forget the term. It's in my notes somewhere, but it ends up being like these mass transfer. Like my grandma participated in it, like where they took people off the reservation and then were able to take more land. So it's a sophisticated way to steal land in a more modern period. Like land theft didn't stop in 1890 or whatever people imagine the closure of the frontier looks like. It's never closed as long as reservations exist. There is still land not being totally occupied by the U.S. state that has more freedom of movement of the commons than outside. And so it's a very important condition to understand when organizing, because there's these little pockets of different rules of the law, and yes, at any time the federal government can go in there. Okay. But as we'll learn with the 1973 occupation, if you know the land better, you can do incredible things and stand up to an impossible force through guerrilla tactics, even in the worst spot ever. Just, they weren't really trying to occupy it. It's a very confusing situation, but yeah, we'll get into it. So these are the conditions leading up to the formation of AIM, and it starts because these men are in prison due to poverty. And that's a very rings to all of our ears, I hope, of many other revolutionaries and or would-be revolutionaries efforts and how they became radicalized, right? And so when they get back to Minneapolis, Stillwater is right there, right? So when they go back to Minneapolis, they start organizing amongst Native people in their own groups, and eventually George Mitchell and Dennis Banks call together like a unity meeting between Native groups to try to what's it called? Coalition? I don't know, but build something different. And I forget the name of the woman who suggested the name AIM, but I believe it's Dennis in his book recalls the story of her saying, well, you're always aiming to do this and you're always aiming to do that. Why don't you just call yourself AIM? Because the first suggestion was like citizens, like Concerned Indian Alliance or something like that, but it's spelled CIA. That doesn't, they're like, wait, we needed a different suggestion. Somebody said AIM. So then they're like, American Indian Movement. That's great. And then they start, at that meeting, Dennis says, well, let's meet back and decide what we're going to do. And Clyde stands up and he's like, well, fuck no. Why don't we go do something right now? All of us are here, and they start what's called the Red Car Patrol, which they took video cameras and spray painted a car red and then would watch cops as they participated in this weekly practice, I should say, of arresting natives at the Indian bars, because segregation, the cops would come in at 9 o'clock on the dot. You could set your watch to it, literally. They'd come in and they'd have the van parked in the back, and they'd come in and start beating the shit out of patrons and arresting them on drunken disorderly, whether they were or not, did not matter. And they'd push them into the vans in the back like a classic kettle style, and would keep them over the weekend to do like community service, like clean up parks and stuff, and use them as a slave labor force, essentially. Yeah, that's happening in the 60s. Minnesota.